Welcome to Season 2 of the Sales Compensation Show, where we share the latest sales performance research, insights, and solutions through in-depth discussions with industry experts. Our goal for Season 2 is to enable our listeners to make smarter decisions based on real-world data and behavioral psychology. Join us for more holistic conversations and discussion about sales compensation and sales force effectiveness that will improve the lives and careers of both current and future sales comp leaders. I'm your host, Nabil Alazam. Today is with great pleasure that we introduce Don Hubbartt, the head of Sales Compensation Center of Excellence at Siemens, where he leads strategic initiatives to optimize sales performance and drive organizational growth. With a career spanning over 17 years at Siemens and diverse leadership roles in compensation and HR across renowned companies like Kohl's Department Stores, Rand, McNally & Company, Don brings a wealth of experience and insights to the realm of sales compensation. As a WorldatWork member and former president of the Chicago Compensation Association, Don is widely recognized for his contributions to the field and his expertise in incentive design, governance, and industry best practices. We're delighted to engage in a dialogue with Don today, visionary leader at the forefront of revolutionizing sales compensation strategies through a data-driven approach and transformative leadership. Don, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Good to be here.
And as I typically ask most of our guests, we all end up here somehow, but it's everyone takes their own different path to get to sales compensation. Would love to hear more about your background and your story of how you landed in this space.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me how I landed on the podcast, and I would say that I'm, hungry for as much media exposure as I can get. But no, how did I end up in sales compensation? Like everything, it's a long, windy road. I think most of us that work in the compensation total award space, probably when we were going through our whatever studies when we were younger, it's probably fair to say we didn't think that we would be in this space. It's sort of, you just happen your way into it. For me personally, I come from kind of a weird family of HR people. So, for example, my dad was a consultant for many years, and then later in his career, he worked for the EOC. I'm married to a HR person, and I've got quite a few extended family that works in HR. The holidays can be very interesting as we talk about our HR experiences, specifically on sales comp. There was a point in time where I literally knew nothing about sales comp. I can remember in my earlier career, I was one of the junior comp analysts, and as senior ranking leader in the company I was at the time said, "Hey, I need you to look into this sales force that we have and convert their measurements from a top line to more of a margin based driven." I sat there and I said, "Yep, sounds good. I had no idea what they were asking me to do. Obviously, you kind of go about later and later on into your career, and you learn through peers externally, you learn through networking, you learn through, the WorldatWorks and local comp associations. You learn through consulting projects that maybe you get involved in. And you just learn by being around people that sort of through osmosis and working on projects that others that know these topics, and you sort of build your knowledge base over time. But anybody can do it. I know this is one of the more technical spaces within, the comp and ben world. But I would say if you're in the compensation space looking to get into this, don't be afraid, because there's plenty of ways, and you really get into some really interesting conversations with leadership about, where we take in the strategic direction of the company. So,
yeah, no, I mean, I agree. It's a role where, to your point, you get initially, it's like, oh my God, there's all this net new stuff that I need to learn, but you're actually engaging with a lot of different stakeholders across the business, and you need to understand how the business operates on every part of the customer journey to do a good job in sales incentives. And so naturally, you kind of you get pushed. I'm curious from your perspective, where you think, in terms of like the careers and kind of that trajectory, you're starting out new in this space, or at least you're kind of entering this space. What's different now versus when you started in sales comp, and how do you see that path in sales comp going forward from a career perspective?
Yeah, I mean, maybe to focus on what's different now than say 15, 20 years ago. I mean, I think there's some pretty obvious answers to that question. We've been through quite a lot of disruption in the industry. There's been quite a lot of global growth. So as you think about having a practice around a global comp plan, it only makes sense if you think about how businesses are seeking to maximize their footprint around the world and have impact in all kinds of buying regions that before were maybe not even thought of as such. So in my current employer, we're literally selling into, 100 plus countries around the world at Siemens. And as a result, we've got, no shortage of questions around the space. Back to the what's changed, you know, disruption based on the pandemic, much more connecting with customers remotely than we ever used to before. So as a result, we've seen quite a strong push from a lot of organizations into investing in, for example, the so-called inside sales role. I think if you look at an inside sales role today, that job looks very different than what we would have traditionally called inside sales maybe even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It's been said by others, during the pandemic, overnight, everybody became an inside sales rep, right? So I think the way of reaching customers, not only just from a people interaction standpoint, but from internet media, one more educated customers that by the time they get to a live salesperson, they already have a pretty good idea of what's out there, what they want. So the role changes a little bit. Those would be some of the things just right out of the gate I observe. I mean, you can ask the controversial question, are we on a path where there won't be? I was at a conference last week where this question came up. Will we ever get to a place where we don't need salespeople? And I don't know the answer to that. Maybe the robots will take over, but I think that question has been asked at quite a few points in time in recent history. And it seems like the answer always is that there needs to be somebody somewhere that's people interactive. And so as a result, how do you motivate that person to perform? Leading thinking is that you give them a aggressive comp plan so that they go out and, help the business grow, help land deals.
I mean, it's an interesting. I feel like there's these predictions that have happened all the time. The death of B2B sales or the death
Yeah.
of sales reps has been kind of a common thing I've heard over the last decade, and the prediction always comes and passes, and yet B2B sales has grown like 20% in that time in aggregate. I think just the thought experiment. Imagine you take a world where you have a future AI bot that helps you purchase. And you have a future AI bot as a company that sells your products. And these two AI bots are talking to each other. I mean, someone has to oversee that. And someone has to, now that the speed of decision making starts to accelerate, so the information flow back and forth, right, accelerates. And so now that just the role of sales starts to shift. I don't think it goes away. But to your point, I mean,
I think where the value creation is happening, that is a very real example, and I could easily see that happening, and maybe it already is in the not too distant future. I mean, there's certain things that we all, either as an organization or as a person, need to buy on a fairly recurring basis, and it's fairly commoditized, fairly transactional. You can't live without it, right? But then I think there's that sort of, how do we create value, and how do we make sure we're staying ahead of disruptive events in our market with our competitors so that we're not left behind. It's well published, the number of strategic partnerships, for example, that Siemens is in right now. A big one that we're very proud of is this NVIDIA partnership. So if you think about how do you reach customers further upstream, I don't think that can easily be automated by chat. I think you still need smart strategic thinking people, being placed in front of the right decision making.
100%. Yeah. The commoditized products become easy to not have sales reps, but now, so I mean, what is a seller? A seller is a problem solver in theory, or should be, to solving a problem for the customer using the solution that we have. And I think that just gets elevated and elevated more so. I mean, to me, I see, I think when we talk about kind of the career and sales comp, it is one of the largest investment vehicles for a go-to-market function, like on the sales side. You spend 10% of your top line revenue on incentives on average. And today we're so bottlenecked in the management and the administration of that expense because there is legal compliance risk, there is financial risk if you don't do it right, that it's rarely given uh, the amount of importance or the weighting that it deserves. And I say this because across the board, I mean, typically you see that sales comp teams are typically understaffed. They're far more work. They end up having, barely struggling to just get to payouts and execution, rather than optimizing every incentive and aligning incentives with the sales process, and really making sure. And I think what we're starting to see, and what I'm seeing firsthand, is from when I started my career till now, is that more and more that is being recognized as a key important part of the organization. I mean, I think this is something I want to touch on with you is, this shift and what we're seeing in the market around sales comp centers of excellence becoming far more prevalent, and this investment and recognition that there's a global coverage to what is one of the largest cost centers.
Yep.
Is a sign to me that this role is going to become more important and have much more of a role within the organization. So I'm curious kind of if that resonates, and then if so, I'd love to dive into kind of your role in building that sales comp center of excellence and what that
Yeah,
means.
I mean, you touch on a lot of good points. It was shared to me last year. So I've been in this new role for about a year and a half. It was shared to me last year, hey Don, so you're managing a global practice around sales incentives. I liked this comment a little bit too much because it was a little bit self-serving. I don't know, but they said, you have the second hardest job in the company. I was like, oh, okay. Well, I kind of like that. And of course, the punchline to that is the first hardest job in the company is actually the frontline sales manager, who has to take all the questions from individual salespeople that they're dependent on, their own skin. But yeah, I mean, this initiative started with it's been a long journey. I think there's any number of conditions that cause a company to pivot and invest in whatever initiative. I think it sometimes can be maybe there was something broken. I think it sometimes can be we seek to just accelerate our thinking on this, and we feel like we need to do something to keep up with our competitors. I think it could be also new leadership and just sort of wanting to kind of inject a different, cultural approach. Um, and so I've been doing this, like I said, about a year and a half. Most of the leading indicators that I see out there, again, back to my point earlier, is that if you think about how my organization, your organization, whatever organization, whoever it is that listens to our podcast here, I think you're probably in some way doing business on a global scale, even if you're a US headquartered company or wherever you're headquartered. There's a really good chance that you've got a global value chain, you've got international business that you're dependent on. And I think somewhere in there is where you start to ask the question, okay, where's all that growth coming from? Who's talking to our customers? How are we sending consistent messages to those people? How do we organize those people, right? How do we describe the work that we do so that we have repeatable, scalable scenarios as we grow and say, okay, now we need to add and invest over here. We've done this before here, and hence the premise for globalizing whatever topic you have. Sales comp isn't the first thing that we've ever globalized here at Siemens. I've been in my prior life in comp and ben. There was any number of topics, not the least of which was the comp team itself. We became a global function back in, what was it, 2014, 2015, something like that. So I think it's a journey. I don't see any trends away from that. I struggle to think of a company that would say, no, we really want to be, maybe if you're in like a super, franchised model or something like that, but I don't see this trend. I see it as a trend consistent with probably what most countries are going to.
Yeah, I mean, it's taking a global approach means that the lessons learned in each individual geography can be then aggregated and applied broadly. The effort to actually execute on any single thing is only done once if you're building a framework for how you solve it. I mean, there are a bunch of there's a bunch of things that have come up in my mind. Like, one, how do you accelerate that? So you're a comp leader. How do you accelerate that adoption of this kind of globalization, or creation of a center of excellence that ensures that
Yeah.
everywhere operates consistently? That's the first part. I'd love to get your input on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just to start with that question, how do you accelerate it? I mean, I think we were on a slow pace, on a gradual pace. Now we're on a much more rapid pace. I mean, just simply me switching jobs is evidence of that. I think it starts really with a firm, clear leadership support view that this is a necessary step in the right direction. And then I think from there, it's sort of how global, how quickly do you want to be? Do you want to be sort of global light, where there's sort of some happy medium in between? Do you want to be purely locally defined, where there's sort of global consulting that goes on? And that was kind of the place where we came from. We had a global framework where we basically trained people around the ecosystem. Hey, here's the best practices on these topics. How do you set eligibility? We created, framework jobs. It said, here are the jobs that if you have these in your region should be eligible for SIP. We didn't prescribe pay mix in that early stage. We were more, here's some thinking around how do you frame pay mix. Um, we did have some kind of thoughts around frequency and trying to move where we're more traditionally meant on like an annual pay cycle and trying to move that more frequently. Catalog of measures, things like that. That was more of kind of the global consulting. We're now moving into more pure, true global approach. So, like I said, leadership for sure is one way that tone from the top support, building trust. A comment, a phrase that I say all the time is part of our job, probably the first part of our job, is we just have to make it make sense, right? And often you're dealing with somebody either in a global environment, or heck, even my old role in a just purely US perspective, we'd have acquired business that came in, and let's say that Salesforce is merging in some way with a different Salesforce, and somebody had to review all that and say, okay, how do we go forward? You have this comp plan, you have that comp plan. Building that trust with those that are responsible to deliver this out to their teams, that's critical. And the credibility that you've seen this before, that you can appreciate the world that they're in, that you're listening. But like I said, that making it make sense is a very common theme that we've been expressing lately.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, if I heard you correctly, it's like building that buy-in to the importance of this at the top level, but then at the same time, building the groundswell with the actual people that are executing on this across the globe and bringing them together to produce a better outcome. Kind of just,
Yeah. And I think you can go super fast on this stuff. You can go even faster than what I just described. If you have a CEO mandate or a board mandate that we will do this, and I've seen that before too, um, absolutely that'll move you faster. And that sometimes can be really helpful when you're sitting in my seat. It's just then, how much damage do you want to deal with along the way? How many people that fall out of the boat, in that process, that you're willing to just sort of sacrifice to the speed of change? I think you do see a much riskier of, negative impacts or missteps or things. If you want to take that fail forward, so-called fail forward fast approach, you can do that. It's just in my experience, sales leaders usually don't love moving that fast. There's usually always a fear. I was having a conversation with somebody in the office recently, and the comment was, well, we're looking at our comp plan, but we don't want to radically change the comp plan. We heard about competitor up the street that did that, and now their people are calling us. So managing that change also is very important from a just disruption in the sales force and losing talent perspective. I think that you can't lose sight of that too.
yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on. It's always like there's always a cost of that change, that hurdle, that cost hurdle. If it's overcome by the upside of moving fast, then it makes sense. Otherwise, absolutely, it's kind of you have to be really sure you want to make a radical shift in comp, given, to your point, the consequences. I'm curious. Um, Again, in theory, this all makes sense, right? You go about this. You have a framework that you apply globally. You bring these synergies in. Um, how do you deal with all the nuances of the management of a globalized concept sales comp when you think about the intricacies, the local and um, the local cultural differences, the local pay differences, and ultimately even the local legislation and compliance requirements that differ so much across all these geos that a company, again, covering an international model has to deal with. I'd say that again, back to the kind of the second point that I'm curious to dive in with you on the center of excellence concept is
Yeah.
that
I mean, I've got an answer. I've got a twofold answer to what I think you're asking me here about, dealing with a wide variety. And I've absolutely in my career seen quite a wide variety of nuance, and we must have this, or here's a measure that we can't live with, or we have to pay for new customer acquisition, and someone else over here has a different view, and you're trying to harmonize this in some way. Two things I would say to that. First, and by the way, any of these profound quotes that I'm having probably didn't originate for me. I'm probably quoting folks that have just influenced me over the course of my career, but I might make a couple quotes here. One is, if there was a perfect comp plan, it probably would have been created a long time ago by people smarter than us, or at least smarter than me, right? So let's just start there. There is no perfect comp plan. I would start with just that idea in mind and just kind of let's zoom out a little bit, take a breath, okay? We're not going to solve, world hunger by getting the proper comp plan put in place, right? So that's the first one. The second one is to the variety question. Um, Absent an approach where one size fits all, I don't know, can three sizes fit all? I think that kind of mentality gets you still on the path of funneling towards standardization, simplification. By the way, nobody loves the word standardization. That won't fly typically when you're out in front of the field.
yeah.
You really have to kind of speak to it more from this terms of simplification, attraction, retention of salespeople, pay for performance, driving growth, right? So my suggestion to the listening audience, don't lead with the word standardization because none of your audience is going to love that. But simplification of the world of that person that's in front of the customer. We want them better, more productive at what they're doing. How do we get that? We make their world simpler, right? So, but that, the three sizes fits all versus one, I think that can be a good sanity check to, okay, we're not going to force everybody into some awkward thing that works for none, but maybe there's similarity and kind of repeatable circumstances that or characteristics that fit.
So I guess even from a definition of best practices, not even at the plan level, you're creating best practices also in kind of buckets. Like, this is best practice A if your legislation looks like this, if your requirements look like this, if your sales process looks like X, versus over here. Is that, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's recognizing that there is not a one set of best practices for an organization that may have multiple divisions, products, and has to deal with all the compliance requirements globally. Like a perfect example I'm thinking about here is, you typically see this. You can move and make changes far faster in some geographies based off of the legislation around what variable comp needs to look like compared to others.
Yep.
And so then all of a sudden now, if you have a best practice around what it looks like to pivot and change, that it's very difficult to set that mandate globally, because it may not, in fact, be possible to do without taking on massive legal risk or cost in one geo versus another.
Yeah, and I think there always will be, take the legal piece of this. Any company has to follow the local law. If you're going to do business in a region, now, of course, you want to seek the proper legal expertise and make sure you're hearing some of the challenges sifting through. Is this a legal topic or is this a preference topic? Because those can be two different things. I don't know if that makes sense, but not everybody just loves it when the headquarters shows up and says, hey, go change. Okay, so the feedback may come, man, we can't do that because our lawyers tell us this or that. Okay, we must respect that. But at the same time, let's unpack that a little bit more. Let's see where we can do our homework a little bit. Let's see what options we have. Again, we're never going to break the law. We want to be always on the up and up with these topics. But I think having a thorough understanding and a good partnership with those folks that are in the field, building that collaboration helps. Exceptions are inevitable, especially in a business like ours. But I think about some of my peers that I would, when I was on the advisory council with WorldatWork for sales comp. I mean, with similar folks in similar industries, and we all have our share of just internal challenges that have to be managed ongoing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very true. I think I agree with you fully in the sense of there's always going to be exceptions in sales comp. The definition of every interaction I've ever had in sales comp is change is inevitable, and there's always a exception that you have to factor in. I think there's this element of, when you build that center of excellence across a global organization, are you setting up a repertoire to avoid net new exceptions or net new unforeseen circumstances? Because every time you're actually building that into your kind of library of this is how we manage this going forward, it becomes part of your best practice. And it goes back to the benefit of not having every geo solving each of these problems from scratch. And I think,
Yeah, I mean, let's take a common one in our world. How many comp plans do you have, right? We asked that question early on. I find it highly unlikely that anybody would start to look at a globalized approach and decide we need more comp plans. They sort of multiply on their own, left unfettered. I think the tendency is that you try to put guardrails on where you manage and have a certain bar where, but even let me back up from there. Part of the challenge in that is just how do you define what is a comp plan, right? I think that answer could vary based on who's asking the question. If the CEO asks the question, that number might be a relatively streamlined number. If it's somebody maintaining your incentive comp module, that could be a much more expansive, just because of the data setups that have to go in. But we did at least forge an internal agreed upon definition taxonomy. Here's how we will count comp plans, so that we could set a baseline and be able to then kind of go back to management and say, hey, here's where we were, here's where in year 2, here's now we're going to be in year 3. And you get everybody kind of thinking in the same direction in terms of just the taxonomy. I keep going back to that. That helps a lot. So
yeah, I agree. I mean, the definition of what a plan is always up for debate. And I mean, I think and
next
and
time
so,
you're at a conference, ask somebody how many comp plans and then after they say that, say, how do you define that? And if you ask 5 people, I'll bet you get 4 different answers.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is where it's there is no consistent way to approach the definition of incentives, and that's part of the problem, because it makes it very hard to then track performance at an incentive level. And this is where the globalized model within an organization, center of excellence, I mean, in theory, what you're trying to do is at least get an understanding of this type of plan is being used in this geo, and this geo. And now I can start to measure the effectiveness of this type of plan across geos from a benchmarking perspective and get a sense of, okay, where is it working? Where is it not? I mean, if you're able to do that and get that consistency, it's not necessarily that you're not going to have a big number of plans, but where it's used, you're not rebuilding it from scratch or tweaking parameters that are so close and similar that you might as well make it consistent if it drives the right results. So
going down this road, this is a question you'll inevitably have to face, in which who's eligible for the sales incentive? Do you include sales support? Do you include customer success? Do you include anybody that's talking to the customer? What's the risk if you include anybody? If you're in a service business, right? We have people in trucks that go out and service things, and maybe they can upsell, but what's the primary responsibility of their job? So you will inevitably face that, and you'll need to form a clear point of view internally so that HR knows how to manage, so that talent acquisition knows how to manage, so that finance knows how to expect things to show up in accruals and things like that. So facing that question is a big one early on as you go down this road, and you'd be surprised how many organizations may not have a unified view on that.
I mean, there's a unified view across, yeah, all the different geos and all the different departments. And then in some cases, I mean, you could argue that in different geos, the sales process might be so different that it does make sense that in one geo, a role should have variable comp, whereas it absolutely doesn't make sense. And so then almost steps back to redefining the roles, right? Like a services/technician type role in one geo may actually be doing a very different job than another geo. What is it? Would that align with kind of how
So
you're
let me, yeah, I mean, I have to stand behind, I think, a concept here that if I lose this one, I'm in trouble, which is one role should have one plan, right? Now, one role might have a couple of plan options, but that same role, if it exists anywhere in the world, really should have the same set of options. For me, you kind of have to set a grounding somewhere. I think
Yes.
if we were to go down the road of, I'm a sales rep in Texas, and that's my job title, and I've got a quota, and I talk to whatever many customers and whatever. If we said that that role, let's say it existed in Toronto, was somehow to be on a different comp plan, I would go back and really ask the question, okay, is this the same job or not? You're telling me the same job, but I'm starting to doubt. It really should start with the role. I know I'm probably sounding like a consultant or something here, but I really think as professionals in this space, we really need to start first with that. You know, what's the sales strategy? Okay, get all that. And then what's the roles? You got to get those roles cleanly defined. That's super important.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so then the question becomes, when you're building out this sales comp center of excellence, do you end up having to do this role
We
level
do.
setting exercise
Yeah,
almost to
we do.
start, right? Because otherwise,
And we have to partner closely with we call it P&O, but the HR organization, because they maintain already a globalized, and whoever's listening may have the same, if you have a global catalog of jobs, as we do, as many big companies, do, that's going to be even agnostic to sales. But then once you're inside of sales, how clean is that data? How commonly understood is that data? Just because you roll out a global job architecture, which we did, does not mean automatically that all your jobs and levels and anything that's tied to that is necessarily anywhere near consistent. So I find often enough, it takes kind of a separate end user of that data to drive consistency and cleanliness of that data, because there's some impact to it somewhere down the line.
so having gone through this, learned from mistakes, seen some of the pitfalls, some of the things that were more challenging, what are the kind of the top three takeaways that you'd have, or or the lessons learned that you'd like to share with those listening that are about to go through a journey like this?
I think first is have a good understanding of where your organization is at today. The old, you got to walk first and then you run and then you fly, or whatever you want to call it. I think doing a realistic self-assessment. How many plans do you have? Do you have good organization of your roles? Even assess the people that are managing these topics today, because guess what? Not everybody's as good as everybody else at these topics. And I'm not saying I'm the best, but what I would say is just having understanding of the lay of the land. Do we have the right expertise? Do we have the right skill sets? Do we have the right systems? Do we have the robustness of policy in place? I would say a mistake that we made early on was we started with design, and I think that's a good necessary place to start, but we really didn't pick up the admin piece until a little bit later. And that did create a little bit of a drag in that, okay, here's the bones of the design, but if we are going to fully start to automate this, guess what? We really need to have a consistent global approach on like pay rules. How do we prorate new hires? How do we handle somebody goes on leave? What happens if somebody gets a salary increase? Does that carry over? All that kind of stuff as you're again trying to drive But it's again, what's your goal? Is your goal total global consistency? Is your goal, local with global just kind of governance, or global best practices? So that would be, you're asking me for my top three. Yeah, so I think the first one is just assessing where you're at. The second is what's management's appetite to push on these topics. I think understand that clearly. What support do you have and from who? Where are you going to run into sales is ripe with internal people that care greatly about how salespeople are paid. I mean, again, that's my second hardest job in the company, right? There's no shortage of opinions on this stuff. So what kind of grounding, what kind of leader support, have a North Star view. So we do have a North Star view that we've created on, here's why we're doing this. And then maybe the third one I would say is build a good network of a community of people, because it's not just one person. I mean, this is not Don Hubbartt doing this all by myself here. This is a whole network of people that we depend on, that have dependencies. There's people dependent on me. There's stuff that I'm doing that depend on others. There's countries that ask questions, or local field stakeholders that ask questions, and having that community of just collaboration really goes a long way. I think that last part is important. This is going to maybe a little crude way of saying it, but having that community of trust, it's like a deodorant for so many of the things that can go wrong. So those would be my comments.
Yeah. I mean, sales comp, if you're doing it in one geo, is already complex in terms of stakeholder management. That third point is spot on in the sense of you now go in a more globalized model, and you have HR team members across the globe, finance across the globe, and so on and so forth. It gets harder and harder. So I'm curious, again, over your career and through what you're seeing as you go through this, as you've gone through this change of kind of implementing a world like a sales comp center of excellence, what other trends are you seeing in sales comp?
Emergence of new roles, investment into new roles. The big one, again, back to the inside sales. I'm seeing quite a lot of expansion into that space, and just the definition of that role being very different than where it was, 10, 15, 20 years ago. I'd say, globalization of practices. I think there's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that having a globalized view is an emerging trend. The tooling has just gotten amazing where we're at now in terms of comp tools that are available, UX designers, transparency to sales reps, automation of how we communicate, interact, log questions from them. So that's been really cool in our space to have just the amount of technology options available. Of course, making that all work with the data is a whole nother, challenge. But those would be my quick trends. I don't think, I'm not seeing a, I mean, we can have the debate about spiffs or other things that emerge to go side. For me, it's always been the dilemma of a sales leader is, how do I get people motivated to perform? And for me, that comes hand in hand with having the right incentive plan, the right mix, the right upside, being able to tell that story in front of the salesperson around, here's how you can outperform and grow. I am, at least the last 10 plus years, I'm not seeing any major shift on like comp design, other than continue to simplify, fewer measures is good. Make sure your pay mix and total comp are competitive. We're also not seeing, every once in a while we get asked this question, do salespeople care about equity? Again, my experience, everybody likes a little equity. Don't get me wrong. I'm not seeing that to be a major driver of comp. So I still think it's like a cash-based approach in what we see. There's not a real groundswell for new forms of comping me. And then maybe the only other one that's, again, a bit of a debate is, what do you reward for? What do you pay for? Do you get any kind of interesting return if you have either wholesale roles or portions of a measure in a salesperson's role tied to building pipeline. Now the traditionalists, and I'm one of them, would say, we're going to pay for what you can book. Or we're going to pay for something directly impacting the P&L. But there are people out there that are doing research, think tanks, exploring, even companies experimenting with, um, you know, BDRs, right? A new role, relatively new role. How do we pay these folks? Because they're literally not involved with booking anything. They're handing it off to the next person to close. So those kind of unique roles, folks that are influencing. If you're in a subscription model business and you've got a customer success person, that's another one where we've kind of played around with. Okay, how do we comp these folks? They're not true salespeople. We don't want them to be true salespeople, but they absolutely are trying to lengthen the deal and lengthen the acceptance by the customer of what we're delivering to them.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting on the comp of additional KPIs, they kind of like the concept of like paying for activity. I mean, back when I was a consultant, same thing.
Yeah.
It was the traditionalist view is makes a lot of sense because you pay for activity. It's not directly tied to the end result. It could be financially very costly. It could drive a lot of, very bad behavior and actually take away from ultimate or what our goal is, which is to create a great customer experience and a customer journey through our buying process. And I think what's starting to change, and I'm curious to get your perspective on this, is that before it was a bit more arbitrary. The definition of a pipeline was a lot more arbitrary, and there was a lot less data to qualify the
Agreed.
status of that.
Yep.
So
Yep.
now
And
we
that's
get more.
what's caused it to emerge is we've got a little bit better ways of measuring than we used to.
Exactly. So as that continues to increase, I mean, the trend would be, okay, well, the more accurate you can be on predicting what good pipeline is, arguably, it is actually one of the best metrics that you should be incentivizing on because it naturally you want to feed the top of the funnel, and then the rest of the funnel kind of makes sense based off of your sales process. You can start to get further out in predicting your forecast and where you need to be and where you need to make investments. But again, it's all predicated on getting it right because a lot of things can go wrong for a sales organization if you incentivize the wrong behavior early on
Yeah.
in the sales process.
Yeah. And in my experience, what you don't ever want to do is get too far into bed with the sales team, because after a while, they'll have you paying for all kinds of stuff. I think for me, the governance model that I've adhered to, or let me say it differently, where things go right or wrong is typically with the inclusion or exclusion of what I call the three-legged stool. So you've got your sales leader, you've got your finance leadership, and you've got your HR. I think between those three, usually, as long as all three of them are grounded in some way to what you're doing, I think you're at a pretty good point of governance. It's instead the opposite, where I've seen failures has often been because one of those three was sort of out of the equation.
Slide. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. 100%. Yeah, you're right. I mean, if the finance leader is not feeling comfortable with that metric that you're incentivizing on being
Exactly.
tied to the financial results,
Right.
that's a telltale sign that you probably shouldn't be incentivizing on it.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's every organization in their own way goes through that. We have a fairly mature, um, regimen around our financials, and so as a result, it allows us to kind of sleep at night a little bit. But at the same time, we're really not moving towards any qualitative type. That there may be pockets here or there when we've got things that we need, but by and large, you know, our clear vision has been we pay what we book.
Yep. Yep. So on that topic of what we pay on and how we pay it, I know this is an interesting conversation we had a little while ago, but this topic of, is variable comp even required, and do you even need variable comp to actually drive a sales motion? I mean, yeah, I'm curious hear your thoughts on it. And
Yeah.
I know it's talking us, as you mentioned earlier, it's talking us out of a job in the world of sales comp. But really, the question,
Yeah. Why do we even do all this? Right.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a fair question that if we don't ask it and someone else asks it and we don't have an answer for it, I think now we do have a bit of a problem. So for those reasons, I understand the thought behind. I get a little bit, it's kind of a fun topic to get onto. I think it also, I've used this approach when I get managers that get so like, it must be this way, right? And we can have all kinds of debates about metrics and goals, and our quota's too high, and where should the threshold of the curve be, and how much can we grow the pay mix one year to the next, and are we market competitive? All that stuff we could debate forever. But what I like about this one and the way it goes is sort of think about if you were to ask your sales reps, especially the experienced ones that have worked for you for a few years, do they kind of think about year over year, given my level of performance and assuming the comp plan isn't like taking money away from me every year, right? Quotas going up massively or, design changes. Assuming that's not happening, since there's a baseline level of trust, do they have an expectation year over year that their, call it W-2 earnings or total comp for the year is about to be X number of months? I think there's an argument that's probably fair to say at an individualized level, that's probably not wrong, right?
yeah,
So if I'm going to expect to earn a certain amount, the argument goes kind of like this, that do we really need all that comp? Do we just trust that that person's going to perform because they've always performed? And therefore you just basically pay them a fixed total target comp amount about to the number that they think they can perform at and just let the results happen. I mean, it's an interesting point of view. I don't personally, like you just said, I don't really prescribe to that. I don't promote that because I think it oversimplifies things a bit. But I think it's interesting to ask that question just to zoom out a little bit and provoke thought on. For me, it's a way of kind of cooling off the conversation and all these debates
yeah. I mean, it's
because
interesting because
that is a perfect compliment.
there's no problem. I mean, but at the end of the day, it's an interesting debate because it's twofold. It's one, arguably, it's about motivation, and the second part is it's about the type of profile that you're looking to hire
Yeah.
and what profile is best for a sales role. And I think sales is not easy. You get rejection after rejection. Like it's a hard role in the sense of if you make a mistake in a sales process, that deal is done, right? Like if you do not meet the customer's expectations at any point, if you don't deliver the sales process and the customer journey the way that the business requires it to, that's it. That deal goes away, and you've lost how much in terms of opportunity cost for that organization. And so, to me, there's an element of it is a difficult role. It's one that's not only challenging, but one that's hard to stay motivated. So right off the bat, you almost need to reward a much bigger upside in order to justify the incremental difficulty of running with this type of difficult role. And the second aspect on the people side is the type of person that's willing to do this type of work is likely doing it because they care so much about the upside and actually setting a very high compensation target and dreaming of making well beyond their OTE. Like the best reps are not aiming to just hit OTE; they're aiming to hit the accelerators and go well beyond. But I haven't met the top 10 to 15% type profile rep that has not been truly motivated by what their W-2 earnings are. And that the W-2 is not a badge of honor in any way relative to their sales career and success.
Yeah, so it's a thought-provoking. Again, I only use it to just kind of dampen down the debates on do we pay X, Y, or Z. I do think in the end that incentive comp practices need to matter. Yeah, you may have your top 25% performers that it probably isn't going to make a deal of difference to them, but you also have new hires, you've got emerging career people, you've got, kind of a wide array of people on their career path. So probably for those reasons. Yeah, but I think also the best salespeople out there don't even think of themselves as salespeople. They think of themselves as like business partners.
Yeah, business partners, solution,
I've
like
got a lot of
solution
friends that are
architects.
salespeople. They love talking about their industry. They love talking about kind of the customers and how deeply familiar they are with their customers and things. They also, the good ones don't spend a lot of time worrying about rejection. They kind of sniff that out quickly and move on to
Yeah,
where they think the opportunity is. So
yeah, 100%. No, we've covered a lot today, and I think it's certainly uh, it's been great having you on the show and kind of again bringing your perspective. And I think for this next shift in sales compensation, I think this globalization model and the center of excellence is definitely again becoming more and more prevalent as we talked about. So I'm glad that we had the opportunity to kind of dive into that and share that with the audience. One question that I always ask is kind of we wrap this up. Are there any resources, whether books, places to go that you think are that you'd like to share with the audience?
yeah, I mean, I would love to say that I've written a book on any one topic because I think I would get a lot of mileage out of that. I think that would sound cool at parties and whatnot, but unfortunately I have not. And I don't feel right about endorsing anyone. I mean, yeah, I've got a bunch of books over there that I read. What I would say is the approach I've always taken to just consuming content, and my suggestion to anyone is kind of, I'd use that word of being an omnivore of information, right? So just consume content wherever you can get it. A lot of good resources with WorldatWork, firms that publish thought articles and things that are really helpful. Get to conferences, network with people, be curious. Just there's a lot of ways to consume content. Pay attention to what's going on in the business world. But yeah, no, I don't have any particular exact recommendation.
Yeah,
but thanks.
I mean,
if I write a book, then I'll come back on the show and I'll hawk it.
yeah, that sounds good. But I do, yeah, I agree. I think the amount of information that is available and relevant, even if it's not directly sales comp. I mean, there's a lot of behavioral psych materials that I find very applicable and relevant as well. So for the audience that's listening, if they want to reach out, get some input, get feedback, or connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Send me a request on LinkedIn, like everybody. Yeah, just find me there. I'm happy to network with others. You probably catch me at one of the known conferences. I'm a friend of the community, so feel free to chat me up.
Awesome. Well, no, Don, it's been great to have you on the show, and really thank you for the time.
Thanks for having me.
The Sales Compensation Show is brought to you by Forma AI, the first sales compensation platform designed around the agile methodology of comp ops. To learn more about how Forma AI can help design, execute, and optimize your sales comp strategy, visit forma.ai. Find us by searching for Sales Compensation on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. On behalf of the team here at Forma AI, thanks for listening.